I always knew my boss Marcus would find some way to humiliate me at the company gala, but I never imagined he'd introduce me as just his secretary to the CEO while I was secretly being groomed to replace him. Sometimes the most powerful revelations come wrapped in dismissive comments spoken with confident smiles. What happened next changed not just that evening, but the entire power dynamic of our workplace forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation to the annual company gala arrived in my email on a rainy Tuesday morning. An elegant digital card with the Horizon Technologies logo gleaming against a backdrop of Seattle's skyline, nestled between mundane project updates and HR reminders about upcoming training sessions. I recognized its significance immediately. The annual gala at Horizon wasn't just another corporate event. It was where careers were made, connections formed, and where the company's vision for the coming year took shape. For someone like me who had spent 3 years climbing from entry-level analyst to senior operations manager, it represented both opportunity and anxiety. "It's here," I announced to my colleague Rachel, who was analyzing quarterly reports at her desk beside mine. The sound of her typing paused as she swiveled her chair toward me, her expression brightening with interest. "The gala invite? Let me see," she said, rolling her chair closer to peer at my screen. I clicked to open the full invitation, scanning the details that appeared. "Black tie optional, Emerald Ballroom at the Grand Pacific Hotel. Speeches from the executive team followed by dinner and networking," I read aloud, a familiar tension forming at the base of my neck. "And look, they've listed the award nominees for the evening," Rachel pointed out, leaning closer. Her finger traced down the screen to a section titled Innovation Excellence Award Nominees. My name, Olivia Mitchell, appeared third on the CHI list of 5 candidates. "This is your moment, Liv," Rachel said, squeezing my shoulder encouragingly. "After everything you've accomplished with the Asia-Pacific expansion, this could be the recognition that finally gets you out from under Marcus's shadow." I smiled at her encouragement while trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. My relationship with Marcus Donovan, my direct supervisor and the company's operations director, had always been complicated at best, toxic at worst. For 3 years, I had navigated his contradictory demands, taken credit for my ideas, and thinly veiled condescension toward what he called my ambitious nature. As a woman with an MBA and background in international business, I should have been treated as a valuable asset. Instead, Marcus consistently positioned me as support staff rather than a strategic contributor. He'd introduced me as his assistant in meetings where I was presenting my own analysis. He'd referred to reports I'd authored as something my team put together. He'd scheduled meetings about my projects without inviting me, then criticized me for not being engaged enough. "You know Marcus will try to take credit if your expansion strategy wins," Rachel said quietly, voicing the concern I'd been trying to suppress. "Let him try," I replied with more confidence than I felt. "The executive team has the full project documentation. They know who did the work." What I didn't mention was the private meeting I'd had with Catherine Parker, our CEO, 2 weeks earlier. A meeting Marcus knew nothing about. Catherine had called me directly, bypassing all normal protocols, to discuss my vision for further international growth. "I've been watching your work, Olivia," she had said, her direct gaze making it clear she saw far more than I realized. "I'm interested in where you think Horizon should be heading next." That 45-minute conversation had felt more authentic and intellectually stimulating than 3 years of meetings with Marcus. "Just promise me you'll actually attend this year," Rachel said, interrupting my thoughts. "No last-minute excuses about needing to finish a report." "I'll be there," I assured her, though the prospect filled me with conflicting emotions. Last year, I deliberately worked late to avoid the gala, Unable to face another evening of being marginalized while Marcus networked his way around the room, dropping casual mentions of my team whenever describing successes I had spearheaded, Rachel returned to her desk, and I stared at the invitation a moment longer before saving it to my calendar. 3 years of strategic patience, of documenting everything, of building quiet alliances with other departments, of exceeding every metric while receiving minimal recognition. Would this finally be the night when the dynamic shifted? What I couldn't have known then was just how dramatically that shift would occur, or that the carefully constructed professional facade I'd maintained would finally crack in a way that would ripple through the entire organization. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparation, both professional and personal. I finalized my presentation materials for the upcoming quarter, drafted contingency plans for potential supply chain disruptions in Malaysia, and spent more than I should have on a deep blue evening gown that projected exactly the right balance of confidence and professionalism. Each decision was guided by a singular hope that this might be the evening when the executive team finally saw me clearly, not as Marcus's support staff, but as the strategic leader I had become, despite his efforts to minimize my contributions. "You're overthinking this," my roommate Tina insisted, as she watched me try on the dress for the 3rd time, 2 nights before the gala. "It's just another corporate party with mediocre catering and too much small talk." "It's not just another party," I explained, adjusting the neckline. "This gala sets the tone for the entire year. Every major leadership decision gets telegraphed. Through who sits where, who gets acknowledged in speeches, who wins the awards." Tina flopped back on my bed with an exaggerated sigh. "Corporate politics sounds exhausting. In my veterinary clinic, the biggest drama is deciding who has to express the anal glands on the difficult chihuahua." I laughed despite my anxiety. "Different kinds of crap to deal with, I guess." "At least mine is literal and straightforward," she countered. "Your boss sounds like he creates messes specifically for you to clean up, then complains about the smell." She wasn't wrong. Just that morning, Marcus had called me into his office with an urgent request. "The executive team needs comprehensive data on how our APAC expansion compares to our European market entry 3 years ago," he'd explained, leaning back in his leather chair. "I need it by tomorrow afternoon for my meeting with Catherine." What he hadn't known was that I'd already prepared that exact analysis 2 weeks earlier, for my private meeting with Catherine. She had specifically requested it not be shared with anyone else yet, as it contained strategy recommendations that contradicted Marcus's approach to regional management. "I'll see what I can pull together," I had replied neutrally, making a mental note to call Catherine's assistant immediately after leaving his office. Sure enough, Catherine's response had come swiftly through her executive assistant. "Ms. Parker says to inform Mr. Donovan that the comparative analysis meeting has been postponed until after the gala. No materials needed at this time." The small victory had sustained me through the rest of the day, though Marcus's obvious frustration at the postponement had created a tense atmosphere in our department. The morning of the gala arrived with Seattle's typical October weather, a misty rain that clung to everything and turned the cityscape into a watercolor painting of muted grays and greens. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, determined to clear my task list so I could leave by 4 to prepare for the evening. "Someone's ambitious today," Marcus commented when he arrived at 9 to find me already deep in analysis of the previous day's logistics reports. "Planning a long lunch?" "Actually, I'm hoping to leave a bit early to prepare for the gala," I replied, not looking up from my screen. "I've already completed the monthly variance report and updated the dashboard with the new KPIs. Ah yes, the gala." He leaned against the doorframe of my office, which was really more of a glorified cubicle with partial walls that didn't quite reach the ceiling. "I've been meaning to talk to you about that. I've asked Stephen to present the Asia-Pacific expansion, results during the Innovation Showcase portion." My fingers froze over my keyboard. Stephen was a junior analyst who had been with the company for 8 months. He had contributed exactly nothing to the expansion strategy. "Stephen?" I repeated, finally looking up. He wasn't even on the project team. Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "I need someone who can handle the technical aspects of the presentation. The executives respond better to data-driven approaches rather than the more administrative overview you'd provide." The familiar flush of anger mixed with humiliation rose from my chest to my neck. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With all due respect, Marcus, I designed the entire expansion strategy. I built the financial models. I negotiated with the regional partners. There's no one better positioned to present those results. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened slightly. This decision isn't up for debate, Olivia. Stephen has already been briefed. Of course, you'll still attend the gala as part of our department's representation. Just focus on making sure everything runs smoothly from a coordination standpoint. He checked his watch. I have a meeting with finance. We'll touch base this afternoon. As he walked away, I sat in stunned silence, the implications becoming clear. Marcus was positioning Stephen, the least qualified person possible, to take credit for the project that had consumed 18 months of my professional life. The project that had been nominated for the Innovation Excellence Award. The project that Catherine Parker herself had recognized as transformative for the company. The urge to quit on the spot was almost overwhelming. 3 years of this treatment had worn down my professional patience to a dangerously thin veneer. But something stronger kept me in my seat. A combination of determination and a secret I had been keeping from Marcus and most of my colleagues. 2 days after my meeting with Catherine, I had received a confidential email from HR requesting a meeting to discuss future organizational alignment. During that discreet conversation in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, Horizon's HR director had outlined a succession plan that included a potential promotion for me to Marcus's position. "Catherine was impressed by your strategic vision," the HR director had explained quietly. "We're evaluating a restructuring that would better align with our global growth. Nothing is finalized, but we wanted to gauge your interest in taking on expanded responsibilities." The knowledge that upper management was already considering Marcus's replacement had given me the strength to endure his increasingly transparent attempts to undermine me. I just needed to maintain my professionalism a little longer. Taking a deep breath, I picked up my phone and sent a text to Rachel. "Emergency coffee needed. Lobby in 5? We met by the building's cafe, and I recounted Marcus's latest maneuver while angrily stirring a latte I was too upset to drink. "He can't be serious," Rachel fumed. "Stephen barely understands how the Asian markets operate. He still thinks Singapore is in China." "Marcus doesn't care about accurate representation," I replied. "He just wants someone who won't outshine him, someone he can clearly position as the junior person presenting his department's work." Rachel studied my face. "What are you going to do?" I considered the question carefully. Direct confrontation had never worked with Marcus. He would simply accuse me of being emotional or not being a team player. Going over his head would validate his frequent complaints that I didn't respect the chain of command. And withdrawing from the gala altogether would only reinforce the narrative that I wasn't leadership material. "I'm going to that gala," I said finally. "I'm going to be impeccably professional. And I'm going to make absolutely sure that everyone who matters knows exactly who developed the Asia-Pacific strategy." Rachel grinned. "That's my girl. Need any help preparing ammunition?" "Actually, yes," I admitted. "Can you pull together the timeline showing when Stephen joined and his limited involvement in any international projects? Nothing obvious, just the raw data. I'll handle the rest." Back at my desk, I spent the remainder of the morning finalizing a one-page executive summary of the Asia-Pacific expansion, highlighting key metrics and strategic decisions with my name discreetly but unmistakably positioned as the lead strategist. I printed 20 copies on premium paper and slid them into my portfolio. At precisely 4:00 p.m., I shut down my computer, gathered my belongings, and headed for the elevator. As the doors were closing, a hand shot out to stop them. Marcus stepped in, eyebrows raised at my departure. "Calling it a day already?" he asked, his tone suggesting I was somehow shirking responsibilities. "As discussed this morning," I replied calmly. "I'm leaving early to prepare for the gala." He nodded slowly. "Right. Well, don't stress too much about appearances. It's really the department heads and executives who'll be in the spotlight tonight." The elevator reached the lobby, and I stepped out first. "I'm aware of how these events work, Marcus. I'll see you tonight." The drizzle had intensified to a proper rain as I walked to my car, but even the weather couldn't dampen the quiet determination that had replaced my earlier anger. Tonight would be different. I had played by Marcus's rules for 3 years, carefully, documenting every instance where he had taken credit for my work or minimized my contributions. The portfolio in my bag contained more than just the Asia-Pacific summary. It contained carefully selected evidence of a pattern of behavior that would be impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding or coincidence. Catherine Parker had already seen my potential. Tonight would determine how many others on the executive team would recognize it as well. My apartment was blissfully empty when I arrived. Tina was working a late shift at the veterinary clinic. I took a long shower, trying to wash away the frustration of the day and prepare mentally for the evening ahead. As I styled my hair into an elegant updo and applied makeup with more care than usual, I rehearsed potential conversations in my head. If Marcus introduced me as his secretary or assistant, how would I correct him without seeming confrontational? If Stephen fumbled the presentation of my work, how would I discreetly provide accurate information without undermining him publicly? If Catherine asked about my earlier recommendations, how could I discuss them honestly without revealing that Marcus had been kept out of those conversations? The blue dress fit perfectly when I finally slipped it on, the color reminiscent of the deepest parts of Puget Sound on a clear day. Professional but striking. Memorable without being flashy. I added simple pearl earrings, a graduation gift, from my parents, and low heels that wouldn't leave me in pain by the end of the evening. The final touch was a small golden pin in the shape of a rising sun, the logo I had designed for the Asia-Pacific Expansion Initiative. Anyone who had worked on the project would recognize it instantly. It was subtle brand reinforcement, a silent claim to my work that wouldn't require words. As I gathered my portfolio, phone, and keys, a text message from Rachel appeared. Operation Credit where credit's due is go. See you there, boss lady. I smiled at her encouragement, took one final glance in the mirror, and headed out into the rainy evening. The drive to the Grand Pacific Hotel took longer than expected due to typical Seattle traffic made worse by the weather. By the time I handed my car over to the valet, it was already 7:20 p.m., 20 minutes after the official start time, but still well before the dinner and awards portion would begin. The hotel lobby was elegant in that particular Northwestern way that combined modern minimalism with natural elements. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, while floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the rain-slicked city beyond. I followed the discreet signs toward the Emerald Ballroom, mentally preparing myself for the evening ahead. Outside the ballroom doors, I paused to check my appearance one final time in a decorative mirror. The woman who looked back at me seemed more confident than I felt, poised, professional, prepared. I straightened my shoulders, adjusted the golden sun pin, and pushed through the doors into the event that would inadvertently change the course of my career at Horizon Technologies. The ballroom was already filled with colleagues dressed in their finest, clusters of conversation forming and reforming as people navigated the pre-dinner networking session. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the space, while subtle blue and green lighting elements echoed the company colors and gave the room an underwater quality that complemented the rainy evening beyond the windows. I scanned the crowd, quickly identifying several executive team members near the central bar. Catherine Parker stood slightly apart, engaged in conversation with our chief financial officer, her trademark silver pixie cut and red glasses making her easy to spot even in the crowded room. There was no sign yet of Marcus or Stephen. "You clean up nice," came Rachel's voice as she appeared beside me, resplendent in a deep green gown. "Ready for battle?" "This isn't a battle," I corrected her, accepting the glass of sparkling water she offered. "It's a strategic repositioning." Rachel snorted. "Whatever helps you sleep at night. Just know that I've already spoken to 5 people about your work on the Asia-Pacific Initiative. Subtly, of course." "Of course," I echoed, grateful for her loyalty, but slightly concerned about her definition of subtlety. "Let's circulate separately. More ground coverage that way." For the next 30 minutes, I moved purposefully through the room, engaging in conversations about the company's recent successes and challenges. Whenever the Asia-Pacific expansion came up, which it did frequently as our biggest initiative of the year, I provided insights and analysis that could only come from someone intimately involved with its development. I was deep in conversation with our marketing director about potential brand positioning in Malaysia when I felt a hand on my elbow. I turned to find Marcus, immaculate in a dark suit, with Stephen hovering nervously behind him. "Ah, Olivia, there you are," Marcus said, his tone suggesting he'd been searching for me rather than just arriving himself. "I was just telling Jeremy about how our department has been supporting the Asia-Pacific rollout." Jeremy Chen, the vice president of global strategy, offered a polite smile. Marcus was explaining that Stephen here will be presenting the results during tonight's innovation showcase. Before Marcus could continue, I extended my hand to Jeremy. "It's good to see you again." "I believe we last spoke at the strategy session in April when I was presenting the initial market entry analysis for Malaysia and Vietnam." Jeremy's expression brightened with recognition. "Of course, the competitive intelligence you gathered was exceptional. It informed several of our subsequent decisions." Marcus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Olivia has been very helpful with the administrative aspects of the project. Speaking of which, there seem to be some issues with the seating arrangements. Would you mind checking with the event coordinator?" The dismissal was so transparent that I saw Jeremy's eyebrows rise slightly. A familiar anger flared, but I kept my expression pleasant. "Actually, Catherine asked to speak with me before dinner," I replied smoothly. A strategic truth, as Catherine had indeed mentioned wanting to continue our previous conversation. "But I'm sure the event team has everything under control. They're extremely competent." Without waiting for Marcus's response, I turned back to Jeremy. "I'd be happy to discuss the current status of our regional partnerships sometime. There are some fascinating developments in Singapore that align with your 5-year vision." "I'd like that," Jeremy replied, looking between Marcus and me with new interest. "Perhaps next week." "I'll have my secretary coordinate with your office," Marcus interjected before I could respond. "Now, if you'll excuse us, Stephen and I need to review his presentation points." As they moved away, Jeremy gave me a questioning look. "Secretary? I thought you were the senior operations manager." "I am," I confirmed, keeping my voice neutral. Marcus sometimes gets confused about titles. The conversation shifted to safer topics, but I could tell Jeremy was processing the interaction with new awareness. When Catherine signaled to me from across the room a few minutes later, I excused myself and made my way to her side, conscious of Marcus watching the exchange. "Olivia," Catherine greeted me warmly. "I've been hoping to catch you. That blue is stunning, by the way. Very appropriate for our ocean-loving city." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely pleased by her notice. I was looking forward to continuing our conversation about regional growth opportunities. She nodded, guiding me slightly away from nearby groups. "Your insights about market-specific adaptation rather than standardized implementation have already influenced our approach to the European expansion planning." The acknowledgement of my strategic contribution, made within earshot of several senior leaders, was exactly the kind of recognition I had been hoping for. We spoke for several minutes about specific challenges in various markets, Catherine occasionally drawing others into the conversation and consistently referencing my analyses and recommendations. It was during this exchange that I noticed Marcus approaching with determined purpose, Stephen trailing behind him like a reluctant shadow. As they reached our small circle, Marcus inserted himself directly beside Catherine, effectively pushing me half out of the group. "Catherine, I've been meaning to update you on our department's progress," he began, barely acknowledging my presence. "Stephen here has prepared an excellent presentation on the Asia-Pacific results." Catherine's expression remained pleasant, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, I saw the agenda. Though I admit I was surprised not to see Olivia presenting, given her integral role in developing the strategy." Marcus's laugh was just a bit too loud, too forced. "Well, we all play to our strengths. Olivia handles the day-to-day operational details. But for strategic presentations, I prefer to have someone with a more analytical approach." He placed a hand on my shoulder in what might appear to outsiders as a collegial gesture, but felt to me like a physical manifestation of his constant diminishment. "Isn't that right, Olivia? You're much more comfortable handling the administrative side of things." Something in me snapped. 3 years of careful professionalism, of strategic patience, of documenting and waiting for the right moment. All of it crystallized into a single point of clarity. This wasn't just about my career anymore. It was about integrity and leadership, about acknowledging true contribution, about the kind of company culture that either valued substantive work or rewarded empty self-promotion. I smiled directly at Catherine, removing Marcus's hand from my shoulder with a subtle but deliberate movement. "Actually, I find I'm equally comfortable with strategic leadership and operational execution." The Asia-Pacific expansion required both, from conceptualization through implementation. I turned to include the others in our growing circle. In fact, I've prepared a brief executive summary highlighting key metrics and decision points from the initiative. I reached into my portfolio and began distributing the one-pagers I had prepared. You'll notice that we achieved 132% of projected market penetration in the first quarter, with customer acquisition costs 27% lower than our historical average for new market entry. The group began examining the documents with interest, while Marcus stood frozen, his expression caught between anger and disbelief. Stephen looked visibly relieved not to be the center of attention. "This is excellent work," commented our chief financial officer, studying the financial outcomes, particularly the currency hedging strategy. "Whose idea was that?" Before Marcus could speak, Catherine answered. "That was Olivia's innovation. She identified the opportunity during her market analysis and developed the implementation approach." Marcus's face flushed. As department head, I approved all strategic decisions, of course. "Of course," Catherine agreed smoothly. "Though, as I recall, you initially recommended a different approach. Olivia's persistence in advocating for this strategy has saved us." She glanced at the document. Approximately $3.4 million in the first 6 months alone. The conversation continued in this vein, with various executives asking specific questions about the expansion that I answered with confidence and precision. Marcus made several attempts to recenter himself, each one less effective than the last as it became increasingly clear who had actually led the initiative. Eventually, the dinner chimes sounded, signaling for everyone to find their assigned tables. As the group dispersed, Marcus gripped my elbow, his fingers digging in slightly as he leaned close. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his pleasant mask entirely gone. "You've deliberately undermined me in front of the entire executive team." I met his gaze steadily. "I simply provided accurate information about a project I led. If that feels like undermining, perhaps you should consider why." "This isn't over," he warned, releasing my arm as Catherine approached. "Everything all right?" she asked, her tone light but her gaze sharp. "Absolutely," I replied, "just clarifying some details about tonight's agenda." "Excellent," she said. "Olivia, you're at table 1 with the executive team. Marcus, you and Stephen are at table 3 with the regional directors." The seating assignment, placing me at the highest status table while relegating Marcus to a secondary position, was not lost on either of us. As Catherine led me toward table 1, I caught a glimpse of Marcus's expression. A dangerous combination of humiliation and fury that would have intimidated me just hours earlier. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I had finally stopped accepting his narrative about my role and capabilities. I had reclaimed my professional identity publicly and unequivocally. Whatever consequences might follow, I knew I would face them with the same clarity and determination that had finally broken through years of careful accommodation. Little did I know that the dinner seating was just the beginning of a night that would reshape not just my position at Horizon Technologies, but the entire operational structure of the company. By the time dessert was served, the true nature of Marcus's management would be exposed, and by the time the awards were announced, I would find myself in possession of information that would permanently alter the power dynamic between us. The evening that had begun with subtle dismissal would end with a dramatic reversal that no one, least of all Marcus, could have anticipated. Because sometimes the most satisfying reckonings come when those who have repeatedly underestimated you suddenly realize, too late, exactly who you've become despite their efforts to hold you back. The executive table was arranged in a strategic horseshoe, with Catherine at the center and key leadership positioned in order of influence and seniority. I was placed between the chief technology officer and the head of global sales, a positioning that wasn't accidental in a company where seating arrangements telegraphed status as clearly as business cards. "We haven't had a chance to meet properly," said David Chang, the CTO, offering his hand. "Though I've heard impressive things about your work with the cross-border data integration." "That's kind of you," I replied, pleasantly surprised that he knew about that aspect of the expansion. The regulatory frameworks in Asia presented some unique challenges. "I imagine they did," he agreed, "particularly in China and Vietnam. Catherine mentioned you found a rather elegant workaround for the data sovereignty issues we encountered in previous attempts." The acknowledgement from another executive validated what I had suspected. Catherine had been discussing my work with her leadership team, separate from Marcus's filtered reporting. A small victory, but significant. As the first course arrived, a delicate salmon tartare with local microgreens, I caught Marcus staring at me from table 3. His expression had settled into something dangerous, a cold calculation replacing his earlier shock. I recognized that look. It was the same one he'd worn before sabotaging my proposal for leadership development last year, claiming budget constraints only to approve a similar initiative from a male colleague 2 weeks later. I deliberately turned my attention back to the conversation at my table, refusing to be intimidated. The dinner progressed with surprisingly substantive discussions about Horizon's strategic direction, international competition, and potential acquisitions. I contributed thoughtfully but judiciously, aware that every comment was being evaluated not just for its content, but for what it revealed about my thinking and leadership potential. Olivia has a refreshingly practical approach to global expansion, Catherine remarked during a discussion about European market challenges. She recognizes that cultural nuance isn't just a nice-to-have, it's fundamental to success. The Asia-Pacific results certainly support that philosophy, agreed Elena Santos, our head of global sales. I'd be interested in your thoughts on our current European approach, Olivia. The invitation to critique existing strategy, particularly one that had been championed by Marcus, was a potential minefield. I navigated it carefully. Our European strategy has many strengths, particularly in the established Western markets, I began diplomatically. Where I see opportunity for refinement is in our approach to Eastern Europe and the Nordics, which have distinct business cultures that don't always respond to our standardized implementation model. Elena nodded thoughtfully. Specific examples? In Finland, for instance, our sales cycle is averaging 7 months longer than projected. The data suggests this isn't a product-market fit issue, but rather a disconnect in how we're engaging with their decision-making culture, which values extensive consensus building before commitment. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Stephen, approaching our table hesitantly, a folded note in his hand. He stopped beside me, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said quietly. "Marcus asked me to deliver this to you. He says it's urgent." I accepted the note with a smile that I hoped conveyed confidence rather than the apprehension I felt. "Thank you, Stephen. And good luck with your presentation. I'm sure you'll do great." His relief at my lack of resentment toward him was palpable. "Thanks, Olivia. I wanted you to know I told Marcus repeatedly that you should be the one presenting. This wasn't my idea." The admission, made within earshot of the executive team, was braver than I had expected from Stephen. "I appreciate that," I said sincerely. As he walked away, I unfolded the note, half expecting a thinly veiled threat or demand to stop undermining him. Instead, I found something far more concerning. Catherine knows nothing about the Singapore contract modifications. Keep your mouth shut during Q&A if you value your future here. The chill that ran through me had nothing to do with the ballroom's air conditioning. The Singapore contract modifications had been Marcus's pet project, changes he had insisted on making to our standard terms despite my objections about potential compliance issues. I had documented my concerns in writing, but he had overruled me, claiming executive authority. "Everything all right?" Catherine asked, noting my expression. I refolded the note carefully. "Just a reminder about some pending contract details," I replied, buying time to consider my options. The Singapore modifications existed in a gray area, legally defensible but ethically questionable, particularly regarding data usage rights. If questioned directly, I would have to choose between lying to cover Marcus's decisions or revealing problems that could potentially damage the company's reputation and relationships. Before I could contemplate further, the lights dimmed slightly and Catherine rose to approach the podium at the front of the ballroom. The formal program was beginning. "Welcome everyone to Horizon's annual gala," she began, her presence commanding, even without raising her voice. "Tonight, we celebrate not just our achievements as a company, but the individual contributions that have propelled us forward in a challenging global market." Her opening remarks were brief but powerful, emphasizing Horizon's commitment to innovation and ethical leadership in the technology sector. As she introduced the first of several presentations highlighting the year's major initiatives, I tried to focus on her words rather than the silent ticking bomb Marcus had just placed in my lap. The Europe and North America presentations proceeded smoothly, with team leaders sharing results and strategic insights. Then Catherine announced, "Next, we'll hear about our groundbreaking Asia-Pacific expansion, which has exceeded even our most optimistic projections in its first 2 quarters." She consulted her notes, then looked up with a slight frown. "According to the program, Stephen Williams will be presenting these results." There was a brief pause as Stephen made his way to the podium, documents clutched tightly in his hands. His nervousness was evident as he arranged his materials and tested the microphone. "Good evening," he began, his voice slightly unsteady. As a junior analyst in the operations department, I've had the opportunity to observe the remarkable success of our Asia-Pacific expansion initiative. He launched into what was clearly a Marcus-approved presentation, full of generic statements about market opportunity and high-level results, without any of the strategic insights or decision points that had made the initiative successful. The executive table exchanged glances as Stephen struggled through slides that he couldn't properly contextualize or explain. When he reached a complex slide showing market penetration metrics across 6 countries, he faltered completely. These results show our successful implementation of the market entry strategy developed by... He looked directly at me, then made a decision I hadn't anticipated. Developed and executed by Olivia Mitchell, our senior operations manager, who led this initiative from concept through implementation. The success metrics you see here are a direct result of her strategic approach to regional customization rather than standardized deployment. A murmur ran through the room. At table 3, Marcus straightened in his chair, his face darkening. Stephen continued with newfound confidence. Since Ms. Mitchell is in attendance and is the true architect of this success, I'd like to invite her to address any questions about the strategy or implementation details, as she would be much better equipped to provide meaningful insights. The spotlight operator, reacting to Stephen's words, swung the beam to illuminate me at the executive table. A smattering of applause broke out, led by Rachel at a side table and quickly joined by others who recognized the unusual situation unfolding. Catherine approached the podium, placing a hand on Stephen's shoulder. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Williams. It speaks well of your character." She turned to the room. "Olivia, would you like to add anything about this remarkable initiative that your team has delivered?" The invitation hung in the air, simultaneously an opportunity and a challenge. Marcus's note seemed to burn in my pocket. The Singapore contract. Modifications weren't scheduled for discussion, but questions about our Asian operations could easily lead in that direction. I rose slowly, straightening my shoulders as I approached the podium. Stephen gave me an encouraging nod as we passed each other, his relief evident. "Thank you, Catherine," I began, looking out over the assembled company. "And thank you, Stephen, for your integrity." The microphone felt cool against my fingers as I gripped the edges of the podium, centering myself. This was the moment to either play it safe or demonstrate the leadership I knew I possessed. The Asia-Pacific expansion represents more than just new markets for Horizon, I continued, my voice growing stronger. It represents a fundamental shift in how we approach global growth. Rather than imposing our standard implementation model, we developed a regionally adaptive framework that respects cultural differences while maintaining core operational integrity. I proceeded to outline the key strategic decisions and innovative approaches that had driven our success, highlighting contributions from team members across departments. The audience's engagement was palpable, particularly from the executive table, where several leaders were taking notes. The results speak for themselves, I concluded, displaying the summary metrics. 132% of projected market penetration, customer acquisition costs 27% below historical averages, and retention rates exceeding our North American benchmarks by 18%. But perhaps most importantly, we've built authentic relationships with regional partners based on mutual respect and cultural understanding. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Catherine returned to the podium, standing beside me rather than taking my place. "Questions for Ms. Mitchell about this impressive initiative?" she invited. Several hands rose throughout the room. The CFO asked about currency hedging strategies. The head of product development inquired about regional feature adaptations. Each question allowed me to demonstrate not just tactical knowledge, but strategic thinking and leadership perspective. Then Jeremy Chen, the VP of Global Strategy who had witnessed Marcus's earlier dismissal of me, raised his hand. "I'm curious about our contractual frameworks in the region," he said, Have we maintained our standard terms, or have there been modifications to accommodate regional expectations? The question wasn't specifically about Singapore, but it opened the door directly to the issue Marcus had warned me to avoid. I felt the weight of dozens of eyes on me, including Marcus's burning stare from table 3. This was the moment of truth, quite literally. I could evade the question, give a technically accurate but incomplete answer that protected Marcus's decisions, or I could be fully transparent about both our successes and our potential vulnerabilities. In that split second, I made the decision that would irrevocably alter my professional trajectory. "That's an excellent question," I replied, meeting Jeremy's gaze directly. "Our approach to contractual frameworks has been primarily consistent with global standards, with specific cultural adaptations in language and relationship terms. However, there have been some substantive modifications in certain markets that I believe warrant broader discussion." The room grew quieter, sensing the shift in tone. "Specifically," I continued carefully, "there have been recent modifications to our Singapore agreements regarding data usage rights and compliance frameworks that diverge from our standard terms. These modifications were implemented at the departmental level rather than through our normal cross-functional review process." I paused, knowing my next words would cross a line from which there would be no return. While I documented concerns about potential compliance and ethical implications of these changes, I want to be transparent that these modifications exist and may require review to ensure alignment with our company values and regulatory commitments. A hushed silence fell over the ballroom. At table 3, Marcus had gone completely still, his expression a mask of controlled fury. Catherine studied me thoughtfully, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for your candor, Olivia," she said finally. "Transparency about both our successes and our challenges is essential to true leadership." She turned to the CFO. "James, please ensure these contract modifications are reviewed by legal first thing Monday morning." "Absolutely," he agreed, making a note. Catherine addressed the room once more. "This is precisely the kind of ethical leadership Horizon needs, the courage to celebrate achievements while also identifying areas for improvement. Thank you, Olivia, for demonstrating both." As I returned to my seat, the applause felt different this time, more measured but somehow more meaningful. I had taken a significant professional risk, but I had done so with integrity and transparency. The remainder of the presentations passed in something of a blur as I processed what had just occurred. I had effectively exposed a potential problem that Marcus had deliberately concealed, doing so in the most public possible forum. There would be consequences. I had no illusions about that. But I felt a strange calm about whatever might come next. After the final presentation, Catherine returned to the podium for the awards portion of the evening. Several recognitions were announced for sales achievements, technical innovations, and customer service excellence. Then she reached the Innovation Excellence Award, the one for which the Asia-Pacific expansion had been nominated. This award recognizes not just innovative thinking, but the leadership required to translate vision into tangible results, Catherine explained. This year's recipient demonstrated exceptional strategic insight, cultural intelligence, and the courage to advocate for a differentiated approach despite institutional resistance. She opened the envelope, though her slight smile suggested she already knew its contents. The Innovation Excellence Award goes to Olivia Mitchell for her leadership of the Asia-Pacific Expansion Initiative. The announcement triggered a standing ovation, started by Rachel and quickly joined by most of the room. As I made my way to the podium, I caught glimpses of various reactions: Stephen's enthusiastic applause, Jeremy's approving nod, Marcus's rigid posture and clenched jaw. "Thank you," I said simply, accepting the Crystal Award. This recognition belongs to everyone who contributed to the Asia-Pacific success. Innovation is rarely a solo achievement. It requires collaborative courage and institutional support. I looked directly at Catherine. It also requires leadership that values substance over appearance and ethical practice over expedient results. I'm grateful to work for a company that recognizes these principles. As I returned to my seat, the weight of the award in my hands felt like a physical manifestation of the shift that had occurred this evening. I had arrived as someone fighting for recognition. I was leaving as someone whose value had been publicly affirmed at the highest levels. The formal program concluded, and the evening transitioned to a more relaxed networking period with dessert stations and coffee service around the perimeter of the ballroom. I was immediately surrounded by colleagues offering congratulations and executives expressing interest in further conversations about my approaches and insights. Nearly 20 minutes passed before I noticed Marcus making his way determinedly toward me, navigating through the crowded room with singular purpose. His expression had moved beyond anger into something colder and more calculating. Rachel appeared at my elbow. "Incoming at 2:00, she muttered. "Want backup?" "I've got this," I assured her, setting down my coffee cup and turning to face Marcus directly. He stopped uncomfortably close to me, attempting to use his physical presence as intimidation. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but intense. "Now. Privately." "I'm in the middle of several conversations," I replied, calmly, "but I'm available for a department meeting on Monday to discuss any concerns." His laugh was short and humorless. "Concerns? You deliberately undermined me in front of the entire company. You exposed confidential operational decisions without authority. You've crossed a line, Olivia, and there will be consequences." I maintained steady eye contact, refusing to be intimidated. I provided accurate information when directly questioned by executive leadership. The only line I crossed was from concealment to transparency. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed. "Those contract modifications were approved at levels you don't even know exist. By Monday morning, you'll be lucky if you still have a job, much less that pretty award." Before I could respond, Catherine materialized beside us, her timing impeccable. "Marcus, Olivia, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," I replied smoothly. Marcus was just expressing some concerns about my remarks regarding the Singapore contracts. Catherine's smile remained pleasant, but her eyes sharpened. "Yes, I imagine he was." "Marcus, I'll need you in the Maple Room in 5 minutes. James and Elena are already there with someone from legal." Marcus's expression flickered between confidence and concern. "Of course. I'll explain the strategic reasoning behind those necessary modifications." "I'm sure you'll try," Catherine replied, her tone making it clear she saw through his posturing. "Olivia, I'd like you to join us as well, since you raised the concern." "She's not authorized to participate in that level of discussion," Marcus objected immediately. Catherine raised an eyebrow. As of 30 minutes ago, when she accepted the Innovation Excellence Award, Olivia was automatically appointed to the Strategic Leadership Committee as per company policy. So yes, Marcus, she is precisely authorized for this discussion. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just failed to prevent me from exposing his questionable decisions. He had inadvertently elevated me to a governance role with direct oversight of departmental operations. "I'll see you both in 5 minutes," Catherine concluded, moving away to speak with other guests. Left alone with Marcus once more, I waited for the inevitable escalation of threats. Instead, he seemed to deflate slightly, reassessing the rapidly changing dynamics. "This isn't over," he said finally, the words lacking their earlier conviction. "You're right," I agreed. "It's just beginning. But it doesn't have to be adversarial, Marcus. We could work together to address the contract issues constructively." He studied me with new calculation. "Always the diplomat, but we both know what happened tonight. You saw an opening and took it, consequences be damned. I saw a responsibility and fulfilled it," I corrected. "There's a difference." He shook his head slightly. You really believe that, don't you? That this was about ethics rather than ambition? I believe they're not mutually exclusive, I replied. Now, shall we join the others? It wouldn't look good to keep Catherine waiting. The Maple Room was a smaller conference space adjacent to the ballroom, elegant, but clearly designed for serious business rather than celebration. When Marcus and I entered, Catherine was already seated at the head of the table, with James, our CFO, Elena, head of global sales, and a woman I recognized as Diane Porter from legal arranged around her. Please join us, Catherine indicated. The two remaining chairs, directly opposite each other. I took my seat, placing my portfolio and award on the table beside me. Marcus sat stiffly, his earlier confidence now tempered with visible caution. Let's be direct, Catherine began without preamble. Olivia raised concerns about contract modifications in Singapore that apparently bypassed our standard review processes. Marcus, I'd like to hear your explanation. Marcus straightened, slipping into his presentation persona. The modifications were minor adjustments to accommodate local business practices. Nothing that creates material risk for the company. Diane from legal tapped her tablet. According to the documentation Olivia submitted in April, the changes involved significant alterations to data usage rights, customer notification requirements, and compliance validation procedures. Those aren't minor adjustments by any standard definition. You've seen her documentation? Marcus asked, clearly surprised. Of course, Diane replied. Ms. Mitchell properly submitted her concerns through the compliance reporting system, which automatically flags potential issues for legal review. The system shows her concerns were dismissed at the departmental level, which would be you, Mr. Donovan. Marcus's gaze snapped to me, comprehension dawning. You filed an official compliance report without discussing it with me first? I discussed the issues with you extensively before the modifications were implemented, I replied evenly. You dismissed my concerns and proceeded with the changes. At that point, I had a professional obligation to document my position through appropriate channels. Catherine interjected before Marcus could respond. The concerning issue isn't just the modifications themselves, though those require immediate review, but the deliberate circumvention of our governance processes. Marcus, you've been with Horizon long enough to understand our commitment to ethical business practices. Everything I've done has been to advance the company's interests, Marcus insisted. Sometimes operational efficiency requires flexibility in processes. James, the CFO, leaned forward. Flexibility is one thing. Deliberately concealing contractual changes that could create regulatory exposure is quite another, especially when a member of your team raised legitimate concerns that you not only ignored but actively suppressed. That's not, Marcus began, then stopped, recalibrating his approach. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding about the significance of the modifications. I certainly never intended to create compliance issues. Intention aside, we now have a situation that requires immediate remediation, Catherine stated. Diane, what's your recommendation? The lawyer consulted her notes. We need to conduct a comprehensive review of all Asia-Pacific contracts, identify any problematic terms, and develop appropriate amendments. Additionally, we should proactively disclose any compliance concerns to relevant regulatory bodies rather than waiting for them to be discovered. I agree, Catherine said. James, please allocate whatever resources legal needs to expedite this review. Elena, we'll need your team to manage the relationship implications with affected clients. Marcus attempted to regain control of the situation. As the department head, I should coordinate the response to ensure consistent messaging and approach. Catherine regarded him steadily. Under normal circumstances, perhaps. However, given your role in creating this situation, I believe an independent review is more appropriate. The implication was clear. Marcus was being sidelined from the remediation effort. His expression tightened, but he offered no further objection. "Olivia," Catherine continued, "as the person who originally identified these concerns, I'd like you to work directly with legal to ensure they have all relevant information about the modifications and their implementation." "Of course," I agreed. "I've maintained comprehensive documentation of all communications and decisions related to the contracts." Marcus's eyes narrowed at this revelation. I had clearly been more strategic than he had assumed, protecting myself with a paper trail while he operated on verbal directives and amended documentation. "There's one more matter to address," Catherine said, her tone shifting slightly. "This situation highlights a structural issue within our operations. Department that I've been considering for some time. The span of control is too broad for effective oversight, particularly as we expand globally." She turned to Marcus. "This isn't a decision I've made lightly or in reaction to a single incident. For several months, I've been evaluating how best to restructure operations to support our growth trajectory while maintaining governance integrity." The atmosphere in the room changed, everyone sensing the significance of what was coming next. "Effective immediately, we'll be dividing operations into two distinct departments," Catherine announced. "Domestic operations will continue to handle North American activities, while a new global operations department will oversee all international markets and expansion initiatives." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I assume I'll be heading one of these departments?" "That's something we'll need to discuss separately," Catherine replied, her non-answer carrying clear implications. "For tonight, I want to focus on ensuring we have a plan to address the immediate contract concerns." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, establishing action items and timelines for the contract review. Throughout the discussion, I provided factual information about the modifications and their implementation, careful to maintain professional neutrality rather than directly accusing Marcus of misconduct. As the meeting concluded, Catherine asked Marcus and me to remain behind while the others returned to the gala. Once we were alone, she spoke directly. "Marcus, I need your key card and laptop before you leave tonight. Security will escort you to collect any personal items from your office." The bluntness of the statement hung in the air. This wasn't a reorganization discussion. It was a termination. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "You're firing me? Over contract modifications? That haven't caused any actual problems?" "I'm terminating your employment for multiple reasons," Catherine corrected. "The contract modifications are merely the latest in a pattern of governance violations, misrepresentation of team contributions, and leadership approaches inconsistent with our values. My decision was made before tonight's events, which simply confirmed its necessity." She turned to me. "Olivia, as the most senior leader in operations with direct knowledge of both domestic and international activities, I'm appointing you acting head of global operations effective immediately. We'll discuss permanent arrangements next week, but I need you to take charge of the contract remediation effort starting tonight." The suddenness of the announcement startled even me. I had anticipated some form of recognition or advancement following the award, but not an immediate promotion to department head, especially not with Marcus still in the room. "I appreciate your confidence," I managed to reply. "I'll ensure the review proceeds efficiently and transparently." Marcus's shock had given way to cold anger. "So this was the plan all along. You've been positioning her to replace me for months." Olivia positioned herself through consistent excellence, ethical leadership, and strategic thinking, Catherine replied firmly. "Something you might have recognized had you been less focused on claiming credit for her work." She retrieved a folder from her portfolio and placed it on the table. "This contains the formal termination documentation, including the non-disclosure and non-disparagement provisions of your employment agreement. You'll also find information about your final compensation and benefits." She slid a pen across the table. "I need your signature acknowledging receipt of these documents." Marcus made no move toward the folder. "I want to speak with my attorney before signing anything." "That's your right," Catherine acknowledged. "However, your building access and system credentials will be suspended tonight regardless. If you prefer not to sign now, we can send the documents via certified mail." The standoff lasted several seconds before Marcus finally reached for the folder, flipping it open to scan the contents. His jaw clenched as he read, but he eventually picked up the pen and scrawled his signature on the indicated line. "You're making a serious mistake," he said, closing the folder with deliberate precision. "I've given 7 years to this company." "And you've been compensated appropriately for that time?" Catherine replied. "Your severance package is quite generous, considering the circumstances." She turned to me. "Olivia, as acting department head, I need your signature as well, confirming the company's execution of these terms." I hadn't anticipated this procedural requirement, that I would literally be signing Marcus's termination papers. The pen felt unusually heavy as I accepted it from Catherine. Marcus watched with undisguised contempt as I opened the folder to the signature page where his name was already inscribed. Below it was a line for authorized company representative, with my name pre-printed beneath it. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Just hours earlier, he had been introducing me as his secretary to minimize my role. Now I was signing the document, ending his employment with the company. I signed my name with clear, deliberate strokes, then closed the folder and returned it to Catherine. "Security will meet you in the lobby, Marcus," she said, effectively dismissing him. "Olivia and I need to discuss transition planning." For a moment, I thought he might refuse to leave, or perhaps launch into recriminations. Instead, he stood, slowly straightened his jacket, and looked directly at me. "Congratulations," he said, the words stripped of any warmth or sincerity. "Enjoy it while it lasts." He turned to Catherine. "She's good at creating the right impression. Let's see how she handles actual leadership when there's no one else to blame." With that parting shot, he left the room, closing the door with exaggerated control rather than the slam his expression suggested he wanted. Catherine and I sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what had just occurred settling around us. "Well," she finally said, "that wasn't precisely how I'd planned to announce your promotion." Despite the tension of the situation, I found myself laughing, a release of the stress I'd been carrying for longer than I realized. Not how I expected to receive it either. Catherine smiled, then grew serious again. "I meant what I said earlier. This decision wasn't made tonight or because of the contract issue. I've been watching your work for over a year, Olivia. You've consistently demonstrated the strategic thinking and ethical leadership Horizon needs as we continue to expand globally." "Thank you," I said, genuinely moved by her validation. "I won't disappoint you." "I know you won't," she replied, confidently. "Now, we have some practical matters to discuss, and then I think you deserve to enjoy the rest of your evening. After all, it's not every day you win an Innovation Excellence Award and a department leadership role in the same night." As we discussed immediate priorities and transition plans, I couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary reversal that had occurred. The evening had begun with yet another dismissive introduction from Marcus, reducing me to just his secretary, despite years of strategic contributions. It was ending with me literally signing his termination papers and assuming his responsibilities. The journey from that moment to this one wasn't just about tonight's events. It represented 3 years of strategic patience, documented excellence, and unwavering professional integrity. I had refused to be defined by someone else's limiting narrative, consistently demonstrating my capabilities until they could no longer be denied or diminished. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a department to lead, contracts to remediate, relationships to rebuild. But tonight had forever altered the trajectory of my career and my understanding of my own capacity for leadership under pressure. As Catherine and I eventually returned to the gala, Where rumors of dramatic changes were already circulating, I felt a profound sense of having crossed a threshold. I was no longer fighting for recognition or struggling against artificial limitations. I had emerged into a new phase of my professional journey, one where I would define my own path forward rather than navigating someone else's constraining expectations. The weight of the Crystal Award in my hand was nothing compared to the weight of the responsibility I now carried. But for the first time in my career at Horizon, that weight felt balanced properly on shoulders that had been ready to bear it all along. I woke the next morning to my phone vibrating persistently against my nightstand. Squinting at the screen, I saw a stream of notifications, dozens of emails, text messages, and LinkedIn connection requests flooding in since 5 a.m. The events of last night had clearly spread throughout Horizon Technologies with the speed and force of a digital tsunami. Tina was already up, leaning against my bedroom doorway with 2 mugs of coffee. "So, acting head of global operations," she said, extending one of the mugs toward me. "That calls for the good beans." I accepted the coffee gratefully, sitting up against my headboard. News travels fast. Rachel called at the unholy hour of 6:15 to make sure I knew my roommate is now officially a corporate big shot, Tina replied, settling at the foot of my bed. "She said Marcus was escorted out by security while you were wearing that blue dress we spent way too much on? Please, tell me that's true, because it's the most delicious corporate drama I've heard since veterinary school." I took a long sip of coffee, trying to organize my thoughts about the previous night's upheaval. It was unexpected. I knew things would change eventually, but not like that. Not so publicly. From secretary to signing his termination. "Papers in one night?" Tina mused. "That's not a career trajectory I've ever heard of." "I was never actually his secretary," I reminded her. "That was just how he introduced me to diminish my role." Tina waved her hand dismissively. "Details. The point is, you went full Cinderella at the ball, except instead of running away at midnight, you took over the kingdom." The analogy made me laugh despite the weight of responsibility I was feeling. "It's not quite that dramatic. I'm acting head, which means temporary. Catherine still needs to conduct a proper search process." "Please," Tina scoffed. "Rachel said Catherine practically announced you as her corporate heir apparent. The acting part is just bureaucratic box checking." She wasn't entirely wrong. Catherine's confidence in my abilities had been unmistakable, but the reality of the situation was far more complex than a fairy tale ending. I now had a department to stabilize, a contract crisis to manage, and a team that had just witnessed their boss being dramatically removed. I glanced at my phone again. Among the notifications was a calendar invitation for 9 a.m., an emergency meeting with the global operations leadership team that I was now expected to run. "I need to get to the office," I said, throwing back the covers. "Apparently, I have a department to run." "On a Saturday?" Tina asked incredulously. "That's your first act as boss lady? Working weekends?" "Crisis management waits for no one," I replied, heading for the shower. "Especially when there are potentially problematic contracts that need immediate attention." 45 minutes later, I was dressed in a charcoal pantsuit that I reserved for our most important client meetings. My hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail that projected competence and control, an exterior that belied the nervous energy coursing through me. "You look like you're about to conquer the world," Tina observed as I gathered my things. "Or at least a small corporate principality." "Just trying to look the part until I fully feel it," I admitted. "Fake it till you make it?" she suggested. I shook my head. "No more faking anything. That's what got Marcus into trouble. I'm just growing into a role I've actually been ready for longer than anyone realized." The drive to Horizon's headquarters gave me time to mentally prepare for what awaited. The offices would be largely empty on a Saturday, but I knew the key players in our contract crisis would be there: legal representatives, finance analysts, and the senior managers from my newly inherited department. The security guard at the reception desk did a double-take as I approached, clearly having heard about last night's developments. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell. Congratulations on your promotion." "Thank you, Frank," I replied, slightly surprised. He knew my name. As Marcus's secretary, I had typically been invisible to the security team. "I've been instructed to provide you with an executive access card," he continued, retrieving an envelope from his desk. "Ms. Parker called it in personally this morning. This will give you access to all operational areas and the executive floor." The plastic card felt unexpectedly significant in my hand, a tangible symbol of the transformation in my position. Yesterday, I couldn't enter certain areas of the building without an escort. Today, doors would quite literally open for me. "Your office has also been relocated," Frank added. Suite 1540, the corner office on the executive floor. Marcus's office, or rather, my office now. The thought was still difficult to process. The elevator ride to the 15th floor was solitary, giving me a brief moment of stillness before plunging into what would undoubtedly be an intense day. When the doors opened, I was surprised to find Rachel waiting, 2 coffee cups in hand. "I figured you could use reinforcements," she said, offering me one of the cups. "The vultures are already circling." "Vultures?" I asked, accepting the coffee. Rachel fell into step beside me as we walked toward what was now my office. 3 senior managers trying to position themselves as your obvious successor in North American operations. 2 project leads suddenly claiming they voiced concerns about the Singapore contracts months ago. And Stephen, who's alternatively terrified. You'll punish him for being Marcus's puppet, and hopeful you'll recognize his 11th hour courage. I sighed. Corporate politics doesn't waste any time, does it? "The power vacuum creates opportunity," Rachel observed. "Everyone's trying to figure out where they stand in the New World Order." We reached the door marked with a temporary nameplate. Olivia Mitchell, Acting Head of Global Operations. Rachel paused before I could enter. "Just so you know, I turned down a direct request from Gregory in marketing to share insights about your management style and priorities. I told him he could ask you himself or wait to find out like everyone else." The loyalty warmed me. "Thank you. For that, and for everything else. I wouldn't have survived 3 years under Marcus without your support." Rachel smiled. "Just remember the little people when you're running the whole company." "You're hardly little people," I countered. "In fact, I'm going to need a senior operations manager I can trust implicitly. Someone with analytical skills, institutional knowledge, and unquestionable integrity." Her eyes widened slightly. "Are you offering me a promotion? Less than 12 hours into your new role?" "I'm identifying critical resources for stabilizing a department in transition," I corrected with a smile. "We can discuss formal titles after the dust settles." Rachel's expression turned serious. "Be careful with early moves, Liv. Everything you do in the next few days will be scrutinized ruthlessly, not just by the team, but by the executive leadership. They're watching to see if Catherine's faith in you is justified." The warning was unnecessary, but appreciated. I was acutely aware of the precarious position I occupied, elevated unexpectedly, under problematic circumstances, with significant challenges to address immediately. "I know," I assured her. "That's why I need people I can trust." We entered. The office, my office, which still bore the unmistakable imprint of Marcus's presence. Dark leather furniture, naval history books lining the shelves, and abstract artwork that had clearly been selected to convey masculine authority rather than personal taste. A box of Marcus's personal effects sat on the credenza behind the desk, presumably collected by security after his departure. The sight was sobering, a reminder of how quickly fortunes could change in corporate environments. "The leadership team is gathering in conference room A," Rachel informed me. "Legal sent 2 representatives, and finance has someone joining remotely from Singapore to help assess exposure from the contract modifications. I nodded, mentally shifting into the operational mode that had always been my strength. I need the complete contract files, all correspondence related to the modifications, and the compliance report I filed in April. Already arranged, Rachel. Confirmed. They're waiting in the conference room. Then let's not keep them waiting, I said, straightening my shoulders and leaving Marcus's lingering presence behind as we headed to the meeting. Conference room. A fell silent as I entered, all eyes turning to assess the woman who had so dramatically ascended to leadership. The long table was surrounded by familiar faces viewing me through a new lens, some wary, others openly curious, a few displaying cautious optimism. "Good morning," I began, taking my place at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming in on a Saturday. I recognize this is a significant disruption to your weekend, and I appreciate your commitment to addressing this situation promptly." I surveyed the room, making brief eye contact with each person present. For those who haven't heard directly from Catherine or me, yes, I have been appointed acting head of global operations following Marcus Donovan's departure. While the circumstances are unfortunate, our focus now must be on identifying and remedying any issues with our international contracts, particularly those in Singapore. Diane Porter from Legal raised her hand slightly. "To be clear, Ms. Mitchell, we're looking at potential regulatory violations in multiple jurisdictions if these modified terms are as problematic as initially indicated." "I understand the gravity of the situation," I acknowledged. "That's why I've asked you all here today to conduct a thorough assessment and develop a comprehensive remediation plan." I turned to Stephen, who sat nervously at the far end of the table. "Stephen, as someone who worked directly with Marcus on the Singapore documentation, your input will be valuable. I want to be clear that this is about fixing problems, not assigning blame. I expect complete candor from everyone in this room." His relief was visible as he nodded his understanding. The tension in the room noticeably decreased as people realized I wasn't conducting a witch hunt. For the next 3 hours, we methodically analyzed the modified contracts, identifying specific clauses that diverged from our standard terms and assessing their potential implications. The picture that emerged was concerning but not catastrophic. Marcus had pushed the boundaries of regulatory compliance without crossing into outright violations, creating a gray area that would require careful navigation. Based on our review, Diane summarized, the most significant issues involve data usage rights that weren't properly disclosed to customers and compliance verification procedures that don't meet regulatory standards in Singapore and Malaysia. We'll need to develop amended terms, conduct a disclosure process with affected clients, and potentially self-report to regulatory authorities. I nodded, processing the information. "What's our exposure if we take no action?" The question was strategic, not because I was considering inaction, but because I needed to understand the full consequences of the situation Marcus had created. Financial penalties could reach 8 figures if regulators determine willful non-compliance, the finance representative replied. More significantly, we could face operational restrictions in Singapore, which would effectively cripple our regional infrastructure hub. "And reputational damage?" I pressed. "Potentially severe," Diane confirmed, particularly if it appears we attempted to conceal the issues rather than proactively addressing them. I made my decision. "We'll take immediate corrective action. Diane, I'd like your team to draft amended contract terms by Monday afternoon. Stephen, work with the Singapore office to identify all affected clients and prepare a communication strategy, emphasizing our commitment to transparency and compliance." As I assigned additional action items, I could feel the team's energy shifting from anxious uncertainty to focused determination. By providing clear direction and demonstrating decisive leadership, I was establishing a new departmental tone, one based on accountability and collaborative problem-solving rather than the fear-driven environment Marcus had created. As the Meeting concluded and people began gathering their materials. I addressed a final critical point. One more thing before we disperse. I understand there's significant uncertainty about departmental structure and reporting relationships given these sudden changes. Catherine and I will be meeting Monday to finalize the reorganization details, but I want to assure everyone that decisions will be based on merit, capability, and demonstrated commitment to Horizon's values, not political maneuvering or historical allegiances. The message was clear. The rules had changed, and success would require genuine contribution rather than the performative loyalty Marcus had demanded. As the room emptied, Rachel lingered behind. "That went better than expected," she observed. Once we were alone. "You've got them focused on solutions instead of speculating about palace intrigue." "That was the goal," I replied, gathering my notes. "We need to stabilize operations before we can implement any structural changes." My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Catherine. "I should take this," I said, and Rachel nodded, slipping out of the conference room to give me privacy. "Catherine," I answered, "we've just finished our initial assessment of the Singapore contracts." "Good," she replied without preamble. "I've been speaking with the board chairman about the situation. He'd like to meet with you this afternoon to discuss the remediation approach." My heart rate accelerated slightly. The board chairman, Victor Harrington, was a legendary figure in the technology sector whose involvement typically signaled matters of critical importance. "Of course," I managed to respond calmly. "What time works best?" He suggested 3 o'clock at his home in Medina. "I'll text you the address. Dress is business casual. Victor despises formality on weekends." The implication was clear. This wasn't just a crisis management discussion. It was an evaluation of my leadership potential at the highest level of the company. "I'll be there," I confirmed, mind already racing through preparation strategies. "Olivia," Catherine added before ending the call. "He specifically requested to meet with you alone. I won't be attending." The statement hung in the air for a moment before Catherine continued. "Victor doesn't waste time with people he doesn't see potential in. This is an opportunity, not just a briefing. Approach it accordingly." After the call ended, I sat motionless, absorbing the magnitude of this development. Meeting privately with the board chairman less than 24 hours after my promotion was unprecedented. Either a remarkable vote of confidence or a test I couldn't afford to fail. Rachel reappeared in the doorway. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm meeting Victor Harrington at his home this afternoon," I said, still processing the implications. Rachel's eyebrows shot up. "The Victor Harrington? Founding chairman Victor Harrington? The man who supposedly conducts job interviews while sailing so he can see how candidates handle unexpected waves." "Apparently he wants to discuss the Singapore situation," I confirmed. "Catherine won't be there." Rachel let out a low whistle. "Talk about trial by fire. First day on the job and you're being summoned to Mount Olympus." The mythological comparison wasn't far off. Victor Harrington had achieved near-legendary status in the industry, a visionary who had built and sold 3 successful tech companies before founding Horizon Technologies 15 years ago. His rare appearances at company events created the same reverential hush as a deity manifesting among mortals. What do you even wear to meet someone like that? I wondered aloud, the mundane questions somehow easier to focus on than the substantive preparation required. "Something that projects confidence without trying too hard," Rachel advised. "Presumably, not the blue dress from last night, though that clearly has good luck attached to it now." I glanced at my watch. "I have about 4 hours to prepare. I need the latest financial projections for the Asia-Pacific region, a comprehensive summary of the contract issues, and at least 3 viable remediation approaches with risk assessments for each." Rachel nodded. "I'll pull the financial data and coordinate with legal on the summary. Anything else?" I hesitated, then admitted the truth. Background on Harrington himself. Not the public biography everyone knows. I need insight into how he thinks, what he values, how he evaluates leadership potential. I might know someone who can help with that, Rachel replied thoughtfully. My cousin worked at TechVantage during Harrington's tenure there. Let me make a call. The next few hours passed in a blur of focused preparation. I reviewed financial projections, drafted remediation scenarios, and absorbed insights about Victor Harrington relayed through Rachel's connection, his preference for straight talk over diplomatic hedging, his impatience with excuses, his respect for leaders who acknowledged mistakes directly while presenting clear paths forward. By 2:30, I was in my car navigating toward Medina, the exclusive enclave east of Seattle, where tech fortunes had built modern mansions along Lake Washington's shore. Victor's address led me to a surprisingly understated property, substantial, but lacking the ostentatious features that characterized many tech moguls' homes. I parked in the circular driveway behind a vintage Aston Martin, taking a final moment to center myself before approaching the house. The woman who answered the door was not the household staff I had expected, but a casually dressed professional in her 60s with sharp eyes and an assessing gaze. Olivia Mitchell, she said rather than asked. I'm Elaine Harrington, Victor's wife and business partner. Come in. He's waiting for you on the terrace. I followed her through a home that reflected thoughtful luxury rather than extravagant display. Open spaces filled with natural light, artwork that evoked emotion rather than showcasing value, and windows that maximized the stunning lake view. Victor doesn't stand on ceremony, Elaine explained as we walked. He'll expect direct answers and honest assessments. If you don't know something, say so. He can smell pretense from a mile away. Before I could thank her for the advice, we reached the terrace where a tall, lean man in his 70s stood gazing out at the lake. He turned as we approached, his legendary intensity immediately apparent in eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they encountered. Ah, the woman who's causing such a stir, he said by way of greeting, extending his hand. Victor Harrington, thank you for coming on such short notice. Olivia Mitchell, I replied, meeting his firm handshake with equal pressure. Thank you for inviting me. Elaine quietly disappeared, leaving us alone on the terrace with its panoramic view of Lake Washington. Sit, Victor indicated comfortable chairs arranged around a small table set with a pitcher of iced tea and a plate of what appeared to be homemade cookies. Elaine insists on hospitality even for business discussions. As I took my seat, he studied me with unconcealed interest. You've had quite a remarkable 24 hours, haven't you? From being introduced as someone's secretary to signing his termination papers and inheriting his department. It's been unexpectedly eventful, I acknowledged, matching his directness. Catherine speaks very highly of you, he continued, pouring tea for both of us. Says you've been the de facto operational leader for international markets for at least a year, despite Donovan's attempts to minimize your contributions. I accepted the glass he offered. Marcus had a traditional vision of leadership hierarchy that didn't always recognize contributions from outside that model. Victor's laugh was sudden and genuine. That's the most diplomatic description of systemic undermining I've ever heard. He leaned forward slightly. Let's dispense with diplomacy, shall we? Tell me about the Singapore contracts, the real story, not the sanitized version. I took a measured breath and gave him exactly what he'd asked for, a candid assessment of how Marcus had modified standard terms to accelerate deals without proper compliance review, how I had documented concerns but been overruled, and how the current situation represented significant but manageable risk if addressed promptly. And transparently, Victor listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing as I outlined the 3 remediation approaches I had developed, complete with financial implications and timeline projections for each. When I finished, he remained silent, for a long moment before asking, "If you were in my position, which approach would you choose?" The question was clearly designed to test both my strategic thinking and my courage in advocating a position to someone with significantly more power, And experience. I would implement a hybrid of options 2 and 3, I replied without hesitation. Immediate client disclosure combined with proactive regulatory engagement, but phased contract amendments prioritizing the highest risk provisions first. It balances transparency with operational stability while demonstrating good faith to regulators. Victor nodded slowly, taking a sip of his tea before responding. And if that approach resulted in the loss of our 3 largest Singapore clients? Then we would have lost them with our integrity intact, I said firmly. Short-term financial impacts, however painful, are preferable to long-term reputational damage and regulatory scrutiny. We can recover from lost revenue. We can't recover from lost trust. Something shifted in Victor's expression, a subtle softening around his eyes that suggested approval. That's precisely what Catherine said you would say. It's also the correct answer, though not the one Donovan would have given. He set down his glass and leaned back in his chair. I founded Horizon Technologies with a simple philosophy, Ms. Mitchell. Technical innovation means nothing without ethical application. We create tools that shape how businesses operate across cultures and borders. That position demands integrity, not just compliance. I nodded my understanding, sensing he was building toward something significant. The board has been concerned about operational leadership in our international divisions for some time, he continued. Donovan's numbers were impressive, but his methods increasingly didn't align with our foundational values. Catherine has been advocating for a leadership change for months, with you as her recommended successor. This revelation surprised me. While I had known Catherine valued my work, I hadn't realized she had been actively positioning me for promotion at the board level. The Singapore contract situation simply accelerated a transition that was already underway, Victor explained. Which brings me to the real purpose of this meeting. He fixed me with that penetrating gaze again. I need to determine whether you're ready for more than an acting title in a restructured department. Catherine believes you are. I'm not yet convinced. The directness was both intimidating and refreshing. What would convince you? I asked. Victor smiled slightly. Direct question. Good. Here's an equally direct answer. I need to know whether you can transform from a highly effective individual contributor into a true organizational leader. Someone who doesn't just manage operations but shapes culture, develops talent, and embodies the values that differentiate Horizon in a competitive marketplace. He stood, moving to the terrace railing to gaze out at the lake again. The global operations role is critical, particularly as we expand into emerging markets where ethical boundaries can be blurry and competitive pressures intense. We need leadership that can navigate those challenges without compromising who we are as a company. I joined him at the railing, sensing that this conversation was reaching its key inflection point. With respect, Mr. Harrington, I've been doing exactly that for the past 18 months. Just without the title or authority to implement systemic changes. I've built relationships with regional partners based on mutual respect rather than contractual leverage. I've developed team members who were overlooked in our traditional structure. I've maintained ethical standards even when pressured to compromise for expedience. Victor turned to face me directly. Those are claims anyone could make. In an interview, Ms. Mitchell. They're not claims, I countered. They're documented results. The Asia-Pacific expansion succeeded not because of Marcus's leadership, but despite his interference. The metrics speak for themselves. Higher client retention, lower acquisition costs, and stronger regional partnerships than any previous international initiative. I met his gaze without wavering. I don't need to convince you I can do the job, Mr. Harrington. I've already been doing it. The question isn't whether I'm ready for the responsibility. It's whether Horizon is ready to recognize who's actually been carrying it all along. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle lapping of lake water against the shoreline below. Then Victor Harrington did something completely unexpected. He laughed, a genuine, appreciative laugh that transformed his intimidating presence into something almost avuncular. "Catherine said you'd make that exact point, almost word for word." He shook his head in evident admiration. "She knows you better than you might realize." The tension broke like a fever, leaving a new clarity in its wake. Victor extended his hand again. "Congratulations, Olivia. Pending formal board approval on Monday, you'll be appointed permanent head of global operations, effective immediately." I shook his hand, processing the significance of this moment, not just for my career, but for what it represented in terms of recognition and organizational values. "Thank you for your confidence," I said. "I won't let you or Catherine down." "I know you won't," Victor replied, his expression turning more serious. "Because you understand something Marcus never did. Leadership isn't about power over others. It's about empowering others through example and opportunity." As our meeting concluded and I prepared to leave, Victor offered one final thought that would stay with me through the challenges ahead. "Remember this moment, Olivia, not just for what you've achieved, but for how it was achieved, through excellence rather than entitlement, integrity rather than intimidation. That distinction will define not just your success, but the success of everyone you lead from this point forward." Driving back toward the city with the late afternoon sun creating ribbons of gold across Lake Washington, I felt a profound sense of alignment between who I had always been and who I was now recognized to be. The transformation wasn't in me. It was in the organization's willingness to see value that had been there all along. Monday would bring formal announcements, structural changes, and the beginning of contract remediation efforts. But something more fundamental had already shifted, not just in my title or authority, but in the validation of a leadership approach based on substance rather than appearance, contribution rather than claim, and integrity rather than expedience. The path forward would undoubtedly hold challenges I couldn't yet anticipate. But for the first time in my career at Horizon, I would face those challenges not as someone fighting for recognition, but as someone empowered to lead authentic transformation, both for the organization and for the talented individuals within it who deserved the same opportunity to be seen for their true capabilities. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, a rarity for Seattle in October. I arrived at Horizon headquarters early, deliberately choosing 7 a.m. to give myself time to settle into my new office before the official workday began. The weekend had been a whirlwind of preparation, reviewing departmental structures, analyzing team performance metrics, and developing a transition plan that would minimize disruption while repositioning key personnel. The executive floor was quiet, most offices still dark as I made my way down the corridor toward what was now officially my space. The temporary nameplate had been replaced overnight with an engraved plaque. Olivia Mitchell, Head of Global Operations. The acting qualifier was conspicuously absent, reflecting the board's Sunday evening vote to confirm my permanent appointment. I paused at the threshold, taking a moment to acknowledge the significance of this transition. Just 3 days ago, I had been fighting for basic professional respect. Now I was stepping into a leadership role with enterprise-wide impact. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "Press release just went out. Prepare for the onslaught." I smiled at her characteristic blend of support and pragmatic warning. Catherine had insisted on a formal announcement before markets opened, ensuring that Horizon controlled the narrative around Marcus's departure and the departmental restructuring. The press release had been carefully crafted to emphasize organizational evolution rather than crisis management, though financial analysts would undoubtedly read between the lines. As I entered my office, I was pleasantly surprised to find the space transformed. The dark leather and naval themes were gone, replaced by modern furniture in cool blues and grays. The imposing mahogany desk had been exchanged for a lighter design that created a more collaborative atmosphere. Even the artwork had been updated to feature abstract landscapes that echoed Horizon's global footprint. A handwritten note sat on the desk in Catherine's distinctive script. "Leadership should reflect the leader. I took the liberty of accelerating your settling in process. The old furnishings are in storage if you prefer them, but I suspected you might appreciate a fresh start. See. The thoughtfulness of the gesture was unexpectedly touching. Catherine understood that symbolic changes were sometimes as important as structural ones, both for the new leader and for those watching the transition. I had just finished arranging my personal items when my assistant Melissa arrived, looking slightly flustered to find me already settled. "Ms. Mitchell, I didn't expect you so early. I was just coming to prepare your office for the day." "Good morning, Melissa," I replied warmly. "And please call me Olivia. We've worked together for 2 years. Formality seems unnecessary at this point." She smiled, visibly relaxing. "Of course. Your calendar is already filling up. The announcement has triggered quite a reaction. The senior leadership team is requesting an emergency meeting. HR needs time to discuss the reorganization details, and there are 6 journalists requesting comments or interviews." I nodded, unsurprised by the immediate cascade of demands. "Let's prioritize internal communications first. Schedule the leadership team for 9 a.m., then HR at 10:30. Defer media requests to corporate communications with a note that I'll be available after we've completed internal transitions." Melissa made notes efficiently. "There's also a delivery for you." She gestured toward a beautiful arrangement of orchids in subtle blues and whites that had been placed on the credenza. "They arrived about 20 minutes ago." I crossed to examine the card nestled among the blooms. "Foundations matter more than facades. Congratulations on creating something authentic. Victor and Elaine Harrington." The gesture from the board chairman and his wife was both unexpected and meaningful, a public acknowledgement of support that would be noticed throughout the organization. "Is there anything else you need this morning?" Melissa asked. "Just coffee and your patience," I replied with a smile. "Today is going to involve a lot of adjustment for everyone, myself included." "Change can be good," she observed, heading toward the door. "Especially overdue change." Left alone, I took a moment to review the detailed transition plan I had developed over the weekend. The reorganization would divide operations into 2 distinct departments: global operations under my leadership, encompassing all international markets and expansion initiatives, and domestic operations, which would require new leadership following Marcus's departure. Before addressing the broader organizational changes, I needed to resolve the immediate Singapore contract situation. Legal had worked through the weekend to develop amended terms, and client communications needed to begin immediately to demonstrate good faith efforts toward compliance. At precisely 9 a.m., the senior leadership team assembled in my office. 5 directors who had previously reported to Marcus and would now form the core of my global operations team. Their expressions ranged from cautious optimism to barely concealed anxiety as they took seats around the conference table in the corner of the office. "Thank you all for coming," I began, remaining standing to establish a different dynamic than Marcus's typically hierarchical approach. "I recognize that the events of the past few days have created significant uncertainty. My goal this morning is to provide clarity about our path forward and address your immediate concerns." I moved to the whiteboard that occupied one wall, sketching the new organizational structure. Effective immediately, operations is being divided into 2 distinct departments. Global operations, which I will lead, encompasses all international markets, expansion initiatives, and cross-border infrastructure. Domestic operations, focusing on North American activities, will be established as a separate department with leadership to be determined. Thomas Chen, the director of Asian markets, raised his hand slightly. "Will we be conducting an external search for the domestic role?" "We'll consider both internal and external candidates," I replied. "In the interim, Rachel Wells will serve as acting head of domestic operations, reporting directly to Catherine." The announcement of Rachel's elevation caused a ripple of reaction, surprise from some, knowing nods from others who had recognized her capabilities despite her previous position below their level in the hierarchy. Now to the immediate priority, I continued. The Singapore contract modifications require our urgent attention. Legal has prepared amended terms addressing the compliance concerns, and we need to begin client communications today. Thomas, I'd like you to lead this effort, working directly with the legal team to ensure our approach respects regional business customs while meeting regulatory requirements. Thomas straightened in his chair, clearly pleased to be entrusted with this critical responsibility. I'll coordinate with Diane in legal immediately. We can have client calls beginning this afternoon. Good. Elena, I turned to our European Operations Director. Please conduct a comprehensive review of all international contracts to ensure we don't have similar issues in other regions. I want complete transparency about any potential compliance concerns, however minor they might seem. The meeting continued with specific assignments and clear expectations for each leader. Throughout, I emphasized a collaborative approach while maintaining decisiveness about our direction and priorities. As the team filed out an hour later, their body language had visibly shifted, shoulders straighter, movements more purposeful, the uncertainty replaced by focused determination. Rachel arrived as they departed, closing the door behind her. Well, you've certainly made an impression, she observed. I passed your former team in the hallway, and they looked like soldiers, who just received clear marching orders. Clarity is crucial during transitions, I replied. Everyone needs to understand both what's changing and what remains constant. She dropped into one of the recently vacated chairs. Acting head of domestic operations? That was unexpected. Is it? I asked, joining her at the table. You've been practically running our North American operations for months, while I focused on international markets. This just formalizes what was already happening. Still, she said, it's a significant jump, from senior operations manager to acting department head in one move. Sound familiar? I asked with a smile. Touché. She laughed. Though your promotion came with slightly more drama. Speaking of which, have you heard anything from Marcus? I shook my head. Nothing directly, but HR mentioned he's already retained counsel to negotiate his severance package. Apparently, he's challenging the termination as retaliatory. Rachel's eyebrows rose. That's rich, considering his documented history of minimizing your contributions and blocking your advancement. If anyone has a retaliation case, it would be you. Catherine isn't concerned, I assured her. The documentation is quite thorough, both regarding the contract modifications and his leadership practices. Our conversation was interrupted by Melissa appearing at the door. Sorry to interrupt, but security just called. Marcus Donovan is in the lobby demanding to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, and his access credentials have been deactivated, but he's becoming insistent. Rachel and I exchanged glances. This should be interesting, she murmured. I considered the situation quickly. Refusing to see Marcus would only escalate tensions and potentially create a more public scene. Meeting with him, while uncomfortable, would allow me to establish clear boundaries while demonstrating confidence in my new position. Please have security escort him up, I decided, and notify Catherine's office as a courtesy. Are you sure that's wise? Rachel asked once Melissa had left. He's likely not in the most rational state of mind. Probably not, I agreed. But addressing this directly is preferable to having him linger in the lobby creating a spectacle. Besides, whatever he wants to say, I'd rather hear it privately than have it circulate through company gossip. Rachel nodded reluctantly. Want me to stay? I appreciate the offer, but no. This is a conversation I need to handle alone. She stood, heading for the door. Call if you need anything. And remember, you're the one with the corner office now. 10 minutes later, Marcus was shown into my office, security lingering discreetly in the hallway outside. He looked markedly different from the polished executive I had worked under for years. Unshaven, his normally immaculate shirt slightly rumpled, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief as he took in the transformed office. "Redecorating. Already?" he asked, his tone acidic. "That didn't take long." "Catherine's initiative, not mine," I replied calmly, remaining seated behind my desk. "What can I do for you, Marcus?" He remained standing, deliberately not taking one of the visitor chairs. "You can explain how you engineered this coup. How long have you been plotting with Catherine behind my back? 6 months? A year?" The accusation was so misaligned with reality that I almost laughed. "There was no coup, Marcus. There was a pattern of behavior that finally reached its natural conclusion." "Pattern of behavior?" he repeated incredulously. "You mean successfully? Leading this department through unprecedented growth? Exceeding every performance metric quarter after quarter? Delivering the most successful international expansion in company history?" "I mean taking credit for others' work," I corrected firmly. "Modifying contracts without proper review. Creating a culture of fear rather than collaboration. And yes, repeatedly undermining my contributions while introducing me as your secretary to minimize my role." His expression darkened. "Is that what this is about? Your wounded pride because I didn't give you enough public recognition? I gave you opportunities others would have killed for. You gave me responsibilities without authority or acknowledgement," I countered. "And when I succeeded despite those limitations, you claimed the results as evidence of your leadership." Marcus began pacing, his controlled facade cracking further. "I brought you into strategic discussions you had no business attending at your level. I gave you project leadership that should have gone to more experienced directors. I advocated for your advancement behind the scenes." "Is that what you tell yourself?" I asked quietly. "Because the documentary evidence tells a different story. Your performance reviews consistently minimized my contributions. Your organizational proposals repeatedly positioned me in supporting roles rather than leadership tracks. Your own emails described me as adequate for coordination tasks but lacking strategic vision, despite implementing the strategy that won the Innovation Excellence Award." He stopped pacing, staring at me with narrowed eyes. "You accessed my emails." "I didn't need to," I replied. HR's investigation following the Singapore contract concerns included a comprehensive review of departmental communications. Your patterns of discrimination and credit appropriation were quite thoroughly documented. This revelation visibly rattled him. The idea that his private communications had been examined and had revealed his true assessments and behaviors clearly hadn't occurred to him. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "I've retained counsel. The board will hear about Catherine's vendetta against me and your opportunistic exploitation of a minor contract misunderstanding." I leaned forward slightly. "Marcus, let me be very clear. This isn't a personal vendetta or an opportunistic power grab. This is the consequence of sustained leadership failures that created compliance risks and a toxic work environment. Fighting. It will only make public what could otherwise remain relatively private." "Are you threatening me?" he demanded. "I'm giving you professional courtesy you rarely extended to others," I corrected. "The choice between a dignified exit with your generous severance package or a protracted legal battle that will expose behaviors you'd prefer remain confidential." For a moment, genuine uncertainty flickered across his face. The first time I had ever seen Marcus truly recognize that he might not control the situation or its narrative. "The board has reviewed the evidence and unanimously approved both your termination and my appointment," I continued more gently. "Victor Harrington himself confirmed these decisions. Fighting this will damage your professional reputation far more than accepting the severance and moving forward." At the mention of Harrington's name, Marcus's expression shifted. The chairman's involvement represented a level of scrutiny and decision-making that would be difficult to challenge, regardless of legal representation. "You've won this round," he said finally. Congratulations on masterfully playing the system. But remember something, Olivia. Success in leadership isn't about winning popularity contests or collecting allies. It's about results that transcend the moment. Let's see where Horizon stands a year from now under your authentic leadership. The condescension in his tone was familiar, but now it carried no weight, no power to diminish or intimidate. It was merely the reflexive posturing of someone whose actual authority had evaporated. I appreciate your concern for the company's future performance, I replied evenly. Rest assured, the commitment to results remains unchanged. The methods of achieving them, however, will align more closely with Horizon's stated values of integrity, collaboration, and recognition of contribution at all levels. Marcus laughed without humor. Keep that idealistic approach when you're missing quarterly targets and watching your star performers leave for competitors offering better compensation and fewer feelings discussions. Is there anything else you needed to discuss? I asked, deliberately shifting to a more businesslike tone. I have a department to run. The deliberate echo of his frequent dismissals to me wasn't lost on him. His jaw tightened briefly before he regained his composure. Just one thing, he said, reaching into his jacket to withdraw an envelope. My formal response to the termination, which I'd like included in my personnel file. It outlines my perspective on these events for the record. I accepted the envelope without opening it. I'll ensure HR receives this. See that they do, he replied, turning toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. You know, the irony is that I actually recommended you for advancement 6 months ago. Catherine rejected the proposal, saying you weren't ready for greater responsibility. Whether this was a final attempt at manipulation or a genuine revelation, I maintained my professional demeanor. Thank you for stopping by, Marcus. Security will escort you out. After he departed, I sat quietly for several minutes, processing the interaction. There had been no shouting, no dramatic confrontations, just the cold reality of a power dynamic permanently altered. Whatever truth or fiction existed in his final claim about recommending my advancement, it no longer mattered. What mattered was how I would use the authority I now possessed to create the environment I had always believed possible. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Heard our former colleague paid you a visit. Everything all right? Handled, I replied simply, moving forward with transition plans. Her response came quickly. Never doubted you would. Leadership team meeting at 2 p.m. to discuss Singapore remediation. Bring your team's proposal. The message was clear, the focus had already shifted from Marcus's departure to the substantive work of addressing the issues he had created. That pragmatic perspective was precisely what I needed to maintain as I navigated my first official day as department head. The remainder of the morning passed in a blur of meetings and decisions. HR required my input on restructuring communications. Legal needed approvals for the amended contract language. Team members sought guidance on priorities and projects in transition. Throughout, I maintained the balance I had determined was essential. Decisive leadership coupled with collaborative engagement, clear standards with genuine appreciation for contribution. By the time I gathered my team for our pre-leadership meeting at 1:30, a new rhythm was emerging. The initial shock of the transition was giving way to purposeful activity. People were adapting to the changed environment with increasing confidence. I've reviewed everyone's input on the remediation plan, I told the assembled directors. Your insights have strengthened our approach considerably. Thomas, the phased disclosure strategy you developed for Singapore clients is particularly effective. It addresses compliance requirements while respecting relationship considerations. Thomas straightened slightly, unused to such direct recognition. Thank you. I've scheduled the first client calls for tomorrow morning after legal completes the final review of amended terms. Perfect. Elena, your compliance verification framework for European operations provides an excellent template for standardization across regions. I'd like to implement it globally as part of our updated governance model. Elena nodded, a smile briefly crossing her typically serious expression. I can adapt it for Asian and South American regulatory variations by the end of the week. As we finalized our approach for the leadership team meeting, I observed the subtle but significant shifts in team dynamics. People were contributing more openly, building on each other's ideas rather than competing for recognition. They were responding to the cultural signal I had deliberately established, that collaboration produced better outcomes than competition, and that recognition would flow to genuine contribution rather than political positioning. At 2:00 p.m. precisely, we moved to the executive conference room for the leadership team meeting. Catherine was already present, along with the CFO, Chief Legal Officer, and heads of major divisions. As my team took their seats around the table, I noticed the subtle but meaningful change in seating arrangements. Where Marcus had always insisted on keeping his team grouped together under his direct control, I had encouraged them to distribute among other leaders, positioning global operations as integrated partners rather than a separate fiefdom. Catherine opened the meeting with characteristic efficiency. As you're all aware, we're addressing a compliance concern with our Singapore contracts. Olivia, please update us on your team's remediation plan. The invitation to lead the discussion, presenting to my peers on the leadership team rather than observing from the sidelines, represented the final transition from my former role to my new position. As I outlined our comprehensive approach to resolving the contract issues while preserving critical client relationships, I was acutely aware of the eyes around the table evaluating not just the plan itself, but my leadership in presenting it. The discussion that followed was rigorous but constructive. Financial implications were examined from multiple perspectives. Legal risks were carefully assessed. Implementation timelines were challenged and refined. Throughout, I maintained confident ownership of the plan while acknowledging valuable input and incorporating meaningful suggestions. This is a well-structured approach, the CFO commented as the discussion concluded. It addresses the compliance concerns without creating unnecessary disruption to our regional operations. I'm particularly impressed with the risk assessment framework your team has developed, Olivia. It gives us clear visibility into potential financial impacts at each stage of remediation. Thomas Chen developed that framework, I clarified, deliberately redirecting credit to my team member. His understanding of regional market dynamics was instrumental in creating a model that reflects actual business risks rather than theoretical concerns. Thomas, seated across the table, straightened slightly at this public recognition, something he had rarely experienced under Marcus's leadership. Excellent work, Thomas, Catherine acknowledged. That kind of regional insight is precisely why we've restructured to give international operations dedicated focus under Olivia's leadership. As the meeting concluded with clear action items and assigned responsibilities, I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, not just for the approved remediation plan, but for the way my team had performed and been recognized in this new configuration. Catherine lingered as others departed, waiting until we were alone in the conference room before speaking. That, she said with satisfaction, is exactly why you're sitting at this table now. You just demonstrated everything Marcus never understood about true leadership. The team developed an excellent plan, I replied. I just made sure it was presented effectively. You did considerably more than that, she corrected. You created space for your team members to shine. You acknowledged their contributions specifically and publicly. You demonstrated both ownership and collaboration simultaneously. That balance is remarkably rare, especially in someone new to executive leadership. Her observation touched on something I had been consciously practicing, the deliberate cultivation of leadership behaviors I had found missing in my own experiences as a team member. It's not particularly complicated, I said. Recognize good work, share credit generously, maintain accountability without creating fear. The basics of effective leadership aren't mysterious. They're just frequently sacrificed for ego or expediency. Catherine smiled. Simple but not easy, as they say, especially when navigating a crisis created by your predecessor while establishing your own leadership approach. She gathered her materials, preparing to leave. The board is meeting tomorrow afternoon for a quarterly review. I'd like you to present an overview of the restructured Global Operations Department and your vision for international growth. Nothing elaborate, 15 minutes on strategic direction and key initiatives. The invitation to present directly to the board so soon after my appointment was significant. Another vote of confidence in my leadership capability and a clear signal to the organization about my position within the executive team. I'd be happy to, I replied. Anything specific you'd like me to emphasize? Catherine considered for a moment. Balance the acknowledgement of challenges with confidence in our path forward. The board appreciates candor about obstacles, but they need assurance that we have the right leadership to overcome them. She smiled slightly. Given what I observed today, I don't think that will be difficult for you to convey. As I returned to my office to prepare for the final meetings of the day, I noticed a small envelope that had been placed on my desk during my absence. Inside was a simple silver pin in the shape of a rising sun, identical to the one I had worn at the gala 3 nights earlier, but crafted in sterling silver rather than gold. A note accompanied it. For your next chapter. The symbolism still fits. R. Rachel's gesture, acknowledging both what had passed and what lay ahead, captured perfectly the transition that was occurring. The gold pin had represented my claim to work that had been attributed to others. This silver one symbolized the opportunity to lead authentically, without the need to fight for recognition or overcome deliberate diminishment. I pinned it to my lapel, a small but meaningful emblem of the journey from being introduced as just his secretary to signing his termination papers, and more importantly, of the leadership approach I was now empowered to implement throughout global operations. The afternoon continued with a stream of meetings, decisions, and conversations that would shape the department's future direction. With each interaction, I consciously embodied the leadership principles I had long believed in but rarely seen practiced effectively. Clear vision coupled with genuine collaboration, high standards with recognition of effort, strategic focus with attention to human impact. By the time I left the office that evening, exhausted but deeply satisfied, one thing was abundantly clear. The transformation wasn't limited to my title or office location. It extended to the organizational culture itself, which was already responding to a leadership approach based on substance rather than appearance, contribution rather than position, and authentic connection rather than power dynamics. The real work was just beginning, of course. Restructuring a department was the easy part. Building a sustainable culture of excellence, integrity, and mutual respect would require consistent effort and unwavering commitment to the principles I had advocated from the beginning. But for the first time in my career at Horizon, I had both the authority and the platform to create meaningful change. Not just for myself, but for everyone who had experienced the limitations of traditional hierarchies and exclusionary leadership practices. As I drove home through the clear October evening, city lights reflecting off Elliott Bay, I felt an unfamiliar but welcome sense of alignment between my values and my role, between my capabilities and my responsibilities, between who I had always been and who I was now recognized to be. The secretary narrative had been permanently rewritten. What remained was to ensure that no one else would have their contributions diminished, their potential limited, or their voice silenced within an organization now committed to recognizing excellence wherever it appeared, regardless of title, background, or position in the traditional hierarchy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.